The next story is this is our next second local story about the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco.
Oh yeah. So I mean, I think there's like a couple parts to this. I think recently with the Board of Supervisors, there was an almost unanimous vote to basically change how funds were being used with regards to a particular ballot proposition. So a couple years ago, there was Proposition C. It was a really big, ballot proposition that was basically the whole tagline around it was to tax the rich to, eliminate homelessness. Even like Mark Benioff got on board and whatnot. Um, and they basically changed how they were going to allocate funds from, Prop C to make it move from going towards, actual permanent housing to shelter beds. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think it's interesting how like local governments decide to approach like local ballot measures and how to like implement this sort of thing. Because like on the other side recently, we saw that SFPD was granted like $9.4 million by this, tech CEO, head of Ripple Labs. I think his name is Chris Larsen. So essentially, a large part of this $9.4 million was to go into straight up get drones. Also to rent out. $2 million of that was to rent out former space that Ripple Labs had in order to kind of provide as like a launch off point, like a literal and figurative launch off point for these new drones that SFPD would be taking in, and then a couple $100,000 for other associated policing stuff. And this is all while understanding that there was a nonprofit that Larson and Ripple Labs was associated with that is facing multiple felony counts for misallocations of funds. And so I think it's personally I think it's like interesting to me that this like crypto bro can just like give money to the state after this like ballot proposition passed last year. I think it was Prop E, which basically was a green light for SFPD to do all sorts of stuff with with expanding their police powers, with less oversight, more money towards drones, more money towards surveillance and all those sorts of things. And I was just curious what you think about this, and like just generally speaking, like we might have a cameo here in a second from our cat.
Well,
Yeah, so I was just wondering, is this type of like increased state security like is this like just the norm now? Because I think there's a lot more examples of this sort of stuff that are happening that I can bring up in a second. And do you really like find it surprising that this is happening in like a blue state under a blue Democratic administration? Or
well, I mean, you think of like the doom loop of the last, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 years. It's really just been about that, creating like the ideological support to justify these massive funds, these massive resource allocations to the police, all under this idea, this myth that like liberals and Democrats like defunded the police in some vague conspiracy theory to destroy America, right? There's this idea that like the police were defunded, all these everything got all lax, and so now like these criminal syndicates are now just running freely through our major cities, which is like not the truth at all. Like the protest movement of 2020 was completely incapable of defunding most police departments. So this idea that like we've defined the police, it's just like it's false, right? So what we see is like I think we see a lot of different things going on. Like I think we have like a lot of austerity being pushed at a lot of local levels, right? So I think we already see like these big financial interests like real estate and tech, like just really taking up all this public money, right? And then I think, and that's just probably this larger trend in society, this growing austerity. I think Trump is just the biggest example of it, right? Of like cutting all these federal programs, laying off federal employees. We really see like this imperialist machine, as different things. Is like see the war in Ukraine as a failure, as the war on Gaza drags on and isolates the U.S. and Israel internationally. You really see this whole imperial system is really deeply in crisis, and that plays out in just like wars abroad, but also like the wars on people, right? They really have to make sure their security forces are in place for when the next George Floyd pops off. At the same time, with all this, people are broke, so these tech bros are not making products that people are buying, so they have to they have to be more aggressive about these public money schemes, right? And I think especially, I guess I'm not surprised. I think if anything was surprising was just kind of how blatant things were. I think like I'm somebody who, I at one point collected signatures for Proposition C, the so-called wealth tax,
same
right?
here.
And the whole idea was, Prop C, we're finally going to get them with this one. This ballot's going to fix homelessness, right? And the idea that if we can get this wealth tax in, we're going to get all the beds, and that's going to solve homelessness. I'll never forget Jenny Friedenbach of the Coalition of Homelessness, with the right hand to God, saying this is going to fix homelessness, and here we are. It didn't solve homelessness. Sorry to call Jenny out like that. That's just that's just her class interest. She's not a bad person, but but that's clearly a bad strategy, right? Like when we try to regulate capitalists with the ballot box, we end up giving millions of dollars to the cops, because I think, even like the use for those funds for addressing homelessness was ultimately like made toothless, like temporary shelter beds, not permanent housing. So again, let's expand the homeless industrial complex, but not expand, housing that's actually affordable for the average person. And so it's just like a multi-pronged attack on the working class.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing I really want to bring up is like when we really just put the power in the hands of the state, like they can decide to do what they want with this. Like this example, it's like they can decide to just take all this money from this person that's implicated with this organization where like somebody's probably going to go to jail for what they did. Like 34 counts of felony fraud of like misallocations of fund is not a joke. People like there are people who worked at City Hall, worked in different departments that are in jail right now for that very same thing in San Francisco. And it keeps happening.
Yeah, it keeps on happening.
A different administration each time, but it still keeps happening.